In our headlines on this Tuesday, April 14th, here in South Korea, President Lee Jae-myung calls on his administration to remain on high alert and to maintain the emergency economic posture as peace talks in Pakistan between the U.S. and Iran fail to bridge the gap over the differences. And tensions continue to mount in the Middle East as U.S. President Donald Trump confirms the start of a U.S. naval blockade of ships to and from Iranian ports in the Strait of Hormuz, as Tehran calls the U.S. action an act of piracy. Meanwhile, back here on the local front, South Korea's shipments of ICT products overseas for the month of March soared past $40 billion for the first time, bolstered by semiconductors. We start here in capital Seoul, where President Lee Jae-myung presided over yet another meeting of his cabinet and emergency economic authorities to call for continued attention on the events unfolding in the Middle East as tensions remain high. Our Blue House correspondent Song Yu-jin reports.
Following the breakdown of peace talks between the United States and Iran over the weekend, President Lee Jae-myung has urged his cabinet to remain on high alert.
당분간은 글로벌 에너지, 원자재 공급망의 어려움 그리고 고유가가 계속될 것입니다. 이를 상수로 두고 현재의 비상 대응 체제를 더욱 확고하게 다져나가야겠습니다.
He made the remarks while chairing a cabinet/emergency economic meeting at the Blue House on Tuesday, hours after the U.S. military began blockading traffic entering or exiting Iranian ports in the Strait of Hormuz. The president first called for the swift implementation of the government's roughly $17 billion supplementary budget, which passed the National Assembly last week. A key part of the plan is the distribution of cash handouts to the bottom 70% of income earners, set to begin on April 27th.
지난해의 민생회복 소비 쿠폰 지급 당시에 일부 지자체에서 일부 지방정부에서 발생했던 비인권적인 행태가 혹여라도 반복되지 않게 각별하게 유념해 주면 좋겠습니다.
He was referring to some local governments using different colors for the voucher-style cash relief depending on income levels, which at the time raised concerns about stigmatization. He also called on the public to help reduce energy use, noting an increase in oil consumption following the government's price cap measures.
결국은 생산 원가와 실제 판매 가격의 차액 부분을 다 정부가 보전을 해줘야 되는데 그게 다 결국은 국민 세금 아니겠습니까?
South Korea froze the third round of fuel price caps for refiners at 1,934 won, or around $1.30 per liter for gasoline last week. Beyond managing domestic demand, efforts to diversify energy supply routes were also discussed. Having dispatched officials to Algeria and Libya, the foreign ministry shared plans to send a special envoy to the Republic of Congo. This comes after President Lee sent his chief of staff to Kazakhstan, Oman, and Saudi Arabia last week to secure additional supplies of crude oil and naphtha. With the conflict dragging on, South Korea is stepping up efforts to minimize disruptions as it relies heavily on energy imports from the Middle East. 송유진, Arirang News.
And U.S. President Donald Trump says a U.S. naval blockade of ships to and from Iranian ports is indeed in place in the Strait of Hormuz, while reaffirming his resolve to prevent Iran from possessing nuclear weapons. Our Kim Bo-kyung has the latest.
The U.S. officially said that it began blocking ships from entering or exiting Iranian ports in the Strait of Hormuz at 10 a.m. Monday U.S. Eastern Time. Speaking to reporters at the White House, U.S. President Donald Trump confirmed the blockade and claimed that Iran wants to make a peace deal very badly, adding that Iran will never have a nuclear weapon.
Iran will not have a nuclear weapon. And we agreed to a lot of things, but they didn't agree to that. And I think they will agree to it. I'm almost sure of it. In fact, I am sure of it. If they don't agree, there's no deal. There'll never be a deal.
According to the Wall Street Journal, the U.S. military deployed more than 15 naval vessels to the region for the operation. Writing on Truth Social, Trump said the U.S. military had obliterated 158 Iranian ships and that any Iranian fast attack ships that go near a U.S. maritime blockade zone would be eliminated. Meanwhile, Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian said that unreasonable demands from the U.S. blocked agreement during talks at the weekend. In a phone call with French President Emmanuel Macron on Monday, he said Tehran had clearly outlined the conditions for the ceasefire and remained committed to them. He further claimed that Iran will continue negotiations only within the framework of international law. Regarding Washington's blockade of Iranian ports along the Strait of Hormuz, Pezeshkian warned that actions that threaten the strait will have widespread global repercussions. Kim Bo-kyung, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, Mr. Trump's allies in the UK and in France have spoken out against his blockade, proposing instead a summit this week to ensure freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. Our Lee Jae has more.
NATO allies are refusing to join U.S. President Donald Trump's plan to blockade the Strait of Hormuz, signaling they will only intervene after active fighting ends, a move that could deepen tensions within the alliance. The announcement comes after weekend talks failed to resolve the 6-week conflict with Iran. Trump said the U.S. military would work with partners to block all maritime traffic through the critical waterway, which handles roughly a fifth of global oil supplies. However, key NATO members, including Britain and France, pushed back, saying they would not participate in the blockade. Instead, they are preparing a separate initiative to reopen the strait and ensure safe navigation once hostilities subside. Britain's Prime Minister Keir Starmer said the UK and France will co-host talks this week aimed at restoring freedom of navigation in the strait.
And, Mr. Speaker, I can confirm today that together with President Macron, I will convene a summit of leaders this week to drive forward the international effort we have built in recent weeks, bringing together dozens of countries to ensure freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz.
He stressed that the talks will focus mainly on diplomatic efforts to bring pressure to bear for a negotiated end to the conflict and for the strait to be opened, and military planning to provide assurance to shipping as soon as a stable environment can be established. French President Emmanuel Macron also announced plans for a multinational mission to coordinate naval escorts and establish rules for safe passage through the waterway. At the United Nations, Secretary General Antonio Guterres called for a continued dialogue between the United States and Iran following talks in Islamabad that ended without agreement. UN spokesperson Stéphane Dujarric said on Monday that the recent discussions were a positive step toward renewed diplomacy, despite ongoing differences.
Given the deeply rooted differences, an agreement cannot be reached overnight, and the Secretary General calls on the talks to continue constructively in order for an agreement to be reached.
He also urged all sides to respect ceasefire efforts and uphold international law, including the principle of freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. Lee Jae, Arirang News.
South Korea, meanwhile, has started talks with Iran to secure the safe passage of 26 Korean flagged ships currently in the Strait of Hormuz. Now, Seoul's foreign ministry has reportedly dispatched a special delegation to Tehran, and details about the vessels have been disclosed to senior Iranian officials there. The 26 vessels and their 173 crew members remain stranded in the strait amid the conflict between Iran and the U.S. These latest talks come in light of the 2-week ceasefire that paved the path for peace talks in Pakistan this past weekend. Also on the negotiating table is humanitarian aid in response to international calls for assistance in the Middle East. In other news, former U.S. lawmaker Michelle Park Steele has been tapped by the Trump administration to head the U.S. Embassy here in Seoul. Our Ian Jin covers this nomination and the protocols ahead.
U.S. President Donald Trump has nominated Korean-American former Congresswoman Michelle Park Steele as the next U.S. ambassador to South Korea. This is according to a presidential nomination document released on Monday that included the former 2-term Republican lawmaker from California. The ambassador post in Seoul has remained vacant since Philip Goldberg departed in January last year. The Blue House on Tuesday welcomed the nomination and expressed hope that her formal appointment would further strengthen Seoul-Washington relations and promote the friendship between the people of the two countries. The nomination comes at a time where Seoul and Washington face a range of joint tasks, including modernizing the bilateral alliance, addressing trade and investment issues, and cooperating on regional and global challenges such as the threats from North Korea and the ongoing Middle East conflict. Steele will be formally appointed upon the approval of the Senate, which could take up to several months. If confirmed, she would become the second Korean American to serve as U.S. ambassador to South Korea after former Ambassador Sung Kim, who filled the post in Seoul from 2011 to 2014. Steele previously served on the President's Advisory Commission on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders during Trump's first term. She was first elected to the House in 2020, then re-elected in 2022, but lost her seat in last year's general election. In a social media post ahead of the 2024 election, Trump gave Steele his complete and total endorsement, casting her as one of the strongest congresswomen in the country and a, quote, America First patriot whose family bravely fled communism. 이은진, Arirang News.
South Korea's shipments of ICT products overseas for the month of March soared past $40 billion for the first time, bolstered by semiconductors. Our Kim Jun-ho reports.
Exports of South Korea's ICT products surged to a record in March, breaking above the $40 billion mark for the first time, driven by strong AI and chip demand. Data released on Tuesday by the Ministry of Science and ICT showed $43.51 billion of ICT exports in March, up 112% from a year earlier. The figure rose by about $10 billion from February, marking a 14th consecutive month of growth. In particular, ICT shipments accounted for more than 50% of the country's total exports. Semiconductor exports were the main driver, jumping 150% year-on-year to $32.84 billion. This marks the first time monthly shipments have topped the $30 billion level. The notable surge between February and March is largely due to increased exports of high-demand memory components.
HBM and conventional memory, including DRAM and NAND flash, appear to have played a key role in driving earnings. Samsung is increasing its HBM supplies to NVIDIA, while prices for standard DRAM have more than doubled, lifting margins. A similar trend is evident at SK Hynix, and that is likely reflected in the overall results.
As production shifts toward next-generation HBM, the supply of general-purpose DRAMs has tightened, pushing up prices across the segment. These supply dynamics are expected to provide an additional boost to earnings in the near term. Mobile phones and computers saw double-digit growth, while displays and telecom equipment posted declines. Meanwhile, exports rose across all major markets, with shipments to the United States and China surging by triple digits. This helped push the ICT trade surplus to $27.36 billion, also setting a new record for a second consecutive month. With demand for AI chips expected to remain strong, earnings are likely to stay solid, with semiconductors taking on a larger share of the economy. Kim Jun-ho, Arirang News.
We are counting down 50 days to South Korea's first local elections under the Lee Jae-myung administration. And while the ruling Democratic Party seeks to consolidate power, the main opposition People Power Party is striving to maintain its stronghold as it currently holds 12 out of the 17 local governments. Our political correspondent Moon Hae-ryun reports.
South Korea's June 3rd local elections are now exactly 50 days away, marking the first major nationwide vote since President Lee Jae-myung took office last year. The results will effectively serve as the first report card for the Lee government, and with the ruling Democrats already holding a majority in the National Assembly, it heads into the contest in a commanding position. President Lee's approval rating currently sits at over 60% for the fifth consecutive week, according to Realmeter, and polling shows Democratic candidates leading in key races across the country, including in traditionally conservative strongholds like Daegu. Party leader Chung Cheong-rae has made the party's ambitions clear.
We will sweep the country in a wave of blue and win the June 3rd local elections.
The Democrats have already confirmed candidates in 12 of the 16 regional races. The People Power Party, by contrast, is still mid-primary in several major districts. The situation is particularly turbulent in Daegu, where two prominent figures cut from the primary are signaling independent runs, a development that could split the conservative vote and potentially hand the Democrats a win in one of the country's most reliably conservative cities. People Power Party leader Chang Dong-hyuk, who grew criticism this week for departing on a 5-night trip to Washington 50 days before the election, has sought to project confidence.
We stand at the threshold of opening a greater future, built on 4 years of overwhelming achievement.
6 regions already have confirmed matchups, including Busan, Incheon, and Ulsan, where People Power Party incumbents will face senior Democratic challengers. Adding to the scale of the vote, up to 17 parliamentary by-elections could be held on the same day, promoting some to call it a mini general election. The most watched seat is in Busan, where the Democrats are courting the presidential AI advisor Ha Jong-woo to run, while former People Power Party leader Han Dong-won has effectively declared his own candidacy in the same district, raising the prospect of a high-profile 3-way race. With voting day still 50 days out, both parties are warning against complacency. Moon Hae-ryun, Arirang News.
Also, the local front, regional tourism rose substantially in the first quarter of this year as more people chose to travel within national borders but beyond the Seoul metropolitan area. In fact, the regional visit rate rose to 34.5%, up 3.2 percentage points. According to the Culture Ministry, the number of foreign visitors entering through regional airports surged almost 50% on year. The number of Koreans making regional trips to places such as Yeongwol, Gochang, Miryang, and Gangjin also jumped nearly 7% on year. These findings are being linked to government campaigns to spur regional tourism, like the half-cost travel program. Korea's southern port city of Busan is one of the most rapidly aging large cities with a high proportion of senior residents. That being said, city officials there have in place a number of employment programs aimed at making effective use of the experience and, in some cases, the empathy of the elderly in the workforce. Arirang's Park Junan files this report from the ground.
Hello, good morning.
A 75-year-old English-speaking tour guide is helping foreign tourists, directing them as they finish a cruise.
Being out here, meeting new people every day, guiding them and greeting them really adds energy to my daily life. Although I've gotten older, I feel appreciated as a member of society. I'm grateful for that.
And when moving to the village health center, it is common to see older adults taking care of other older adults. Programs such as health surveys and exercise sessions help people stay active and in shape. Some work involves classifying waste medication or disposing of it properly, crucial to environmental safety.
What you're seeing here is part of a citywide senior job program in Busan, with over 70,000 older people, about 10% of the elderly population, taking part.
And this is just a few examples out of numerous types of jobs that senior workers can take part in.
We want to show that we are not simply recipients of help, but are active contributors who add value to the community. We hope citizens will see us not as retired elderly, but as professionals with experience and wisdom.
For Busan, the number of older adults has already outpaced the city's young population of 19 to 34-year-olds. For the city, being able to bring older adults to the workplace is a must rather than a choice.
If we approach older adults as social resources who can play a role as members of the local community, I believe employment programs like this can function effectively in cities around the world.
For many cities and the global economy, as the city shifts into a super-aged society, the case of Busan serves as a real-world testbed. Park Junan, Arirang News, Busan.
This is The World Now, bringing you everything you need to know from around the globe. Hezbollah's leader on Monday publicly demanded that Lebanon cancel direct talks with Israel. The talks scheduled for Tuesday in Washington would be the first such face-to-face negotiations between the two countries in decades. Naim Qassem made the televised appeal, calling the meeting a free concession to Israel and the United States. Meanwhile, fierce fighting rages in the southern Lebanese town of Bint Jabal, where Israeli forces encircled the area and Hezbollah fighters launched rockets, artillery, and drones. Israel's military said its troops killed more than 100 Hezbollah fighters in the town and surrounding areas. President Donald Trump on Monday refused to apologize to Pope Leo XIV after launching a public attack on the Catholic Church's leader over his opposition to the U.S. war in Iran. Trump criticized the Pope on social media on Sunday, calling him weak on crime and terrible for foreign policy, then posted an AI-generated image depicting himself as a Jesus-like figure laying hands on a sick man. Following a backlash, the image was deleted on Monday, and Trump told reporters it was meant to show him as a doctor, not as Jesus. Pope Leo on Monday said we'll continue speaking out loudly against war. 2 days before tax day in the U.S., President Donald Trump on Monday had 2 bags of McDonald's food delivered to the Oval Office by a DoorDash driver, then handed her a $100 tip on camera to promote his administration's tax cut on tips. Driver Sharon Simmons from Arkansas told Trump the policy had put $11,000 back in her pocket as her husband battled cancer. When a reporter asked if the White House were good tippers, Trump reached into his pocket and handed her the $100 bill. Colombia on Monday ordered the killing of up to 80 hippos. The hippos are the wild descendants of animals drug lord Pablo Escobar illegally imported decades ago. They have spread across the country, threatening villagers and wiping out native species. Colombia's environment minister did not say when the culling would begin. Colombia is the only country outside Africa with a wild hippo population. Chu Ji-hyun, Arirang News.
Tomorrow, early summer heat will continue in the western regions. Temperatures will rise well above seasonal averages, reaching up to 27 degrees Celsius. Meanwhile, along the east coast, where there are easterly winds, and along with some rain on the south coast, it'll feel relatively cooler. As for air quality, ultra-fine dust levels are expected to be good in most areas. And Jeju Island could see occasional rain through tomorrow morning. Tomorrow's Seoul will start the day at 12 degrees, Chuncheon at 9 degrees, Busan at 13 degrees. Then by the afternoon, Seoul will get up to 25 degrees, Gwangju at 27 degrees, Busan at 19 degrees. Looking ahead, warm conditions with daytime highs above 25 degrees will continue. More rain is expected across the southern regions and on Jeju Island this Friday. Now here's a look at the weather around the world.
Right, those are the headlines at this hour here in South Korea. As always, thank you for watching.